Don't touch my car. The words snapped through the underground garage before Naomi Carter even realized she had stepped too close, her heel pausing mid-stride as the echo of expensive engines and dripping water filled the concrete space, the air thick with gasoline and impatience. She turned slightly, one hand tightening around a thin stack of case files pressed to her chest, the fluorescent lights above flickering just enough to cast shadows across her face. Richard Whitmore stood a few feet away beside a polished black SUV that gleamed like a mirror, his expression tight, controlled, the kind of man who expected the world to move around him. Emily Whitmore stood just behind him, arms folded, her gaze sliding over Naomi in a single glance that measured and dismissed in the same breath. Naomi stepped back instinctively, her shoulder brushing against the cold wall as a few papers slipped loose and drifted down to the concrete floor. The sound soft but sharp in the silence that followed. For a moment no one moved. Then Emily exhaled a quiet laugh, not loud, not kind, just enough to linger. "You should really watch where you're going," she said, her tone smooth but edged. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly to the scattered pages, each one carefully organized, marked, prepared for a morning that mattered more than anyone here could see. Her fingers moved quickly, gathering them one by one, steady despite the tension coiling in her chest around them. Footsteps passed, distant, uninterested, a security camera blinked red in the corner, but no one slowed. No one stepped in. Richard adjusted his cufflinks as if the moment had already ended, his voice calm, dismissive. "People come down here and forget their place," he muttered, not quite to her, not quite to himself. Naomi paused with the last sheet in her hand, the edge slightly bent. She smoothed it carefully, pressing it flat against the stack, her breath slow, controlled. The kind of control built over years of being seen and unseen at the same time. She stood then, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to meet their line of sight. The hum of the overhead lights filled the gap between them. For a second the world seemed to narrow to the space of a few feet of concrete. Her voice when it came was quiet but clear. "You don't get to decide someone's place." The sentence hung there, simple, unshaken. Emily's brow lifted just slightly, surprised not by the words but by the tone, the lack of apology in it. Richard let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh, glancing past Naomi as if she had already disappeared. "We're done here," he said, turning away, the sound of his shoes striking the concrete echoing again. Emily followed, her gaze lingering for half a second longer before she pivoted, heels clicking sharply as they walked toward the elevator doors. Naomi remained where she was for a moment, the papers held close again, the cool air settling back around her. She exhaled slowly, the tension easing from her shoulders not in defeat, but in restraint. Somewhere above, faint and distant, a door opened. Voices carried down the stairwell, the day moving forward without pause. Naomi adjusted the stack in her hands, straightened the edge of her sleeve, and began walking toward the same set of elevators. Her steps measured, quiet, blending into the rhythm of the building, as if nothing had happened, as if everything had. The elevator door slid open with a soft chime that barely cut through the low hum of the building waking up. Naomi Carter stepped inside without hesitation, her reflection briefly catching in the brushed steel walls. Steady eyes, composed expression, nothing out of place except the faint trace of dust still clinging to the edge of her sleeve. She pressed the button for the upper floors, the number lighting up in a quiet glow. The doors closing slowly as footsteps echoed somewhere behind her, but never reached her. Inside the elevator the air felt cooler, stiller, like a pause between two different worlds. She adjusted the stack of files in her hands, aligning the corners with precise care. Each page a piece of something larger, something that had taken years of study, long nights, and silent determination to reach. The elevator began its ascent, smooth and controlled, numbers ticking upward one by one. With each floor the noise of the garage faded further away, replaced by a distant quiet that felt almost deliberate. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not from weakness but from focus, her mind already moving ahead, reviewing arguments, anticipating questions, preparing for a room where every word would carry weight. The doors opened again onto a polished hallway lined with dark wood panels and soft lighting. the contrast was immediate. The air smelled faintly of clean linen and coffee. Footsteps here were quieter, measured. People passed with folders in hand, voices low, respectful. A few glanced in her direction but did not linger. Not yet. Naomi stepped forward, her heels now echoing in a different rhythm, one that matched the calm precision of the space. She moved past glass offices and framed certificates, past doors marked with names that carried authority, none of it unfamiliar, none of it intimidating. At the far end of the corridor, a set of double doors stood closed, tall and heavy, the kind that separated observation from judgment. Naomi slowed as she approached, her hand briefly tightening around the files before loosening again, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface. For a moment, the memory of the garage flickered across her mind. The laughter, the dismissal, the assumption written so easily across their faces. She did not react to it, did not carry it forward. She simply let it pass through her like background noise fading behind a closed door. A clerk stood nearby, organizing documents, glancing up as Naomi approached, their posture straightening almost instinctively. "Good morning," the clerk said, voice respectful. Naomi nodded once in return, calm, composed. She handed over the files without hesitation, the clerk accepting them carefully as if they understood the weight behind each page. Somewhere inside the courtroom chairs shifted, a low murmur rising and falling like distant waves. Naomi stepped closer to the doors, the sound of her own breath. Steady, controlled. She placed one hand lightly against the handle but did not open it yet. Instead, she paused, just long enough to center herself, to let the quiet settle completely. Then, without rush or doubt, she pushed the doors open and stepped inside, the room unfolding before her in rows of polished wood and attentive faces, the air thick with expectation. And as she moved forward toward the bench, the space itself seemed to adjust, conversation stilled, eyes turned, and somewhere near the front row, two figures shifted in their seats as recognition began to rise, slow and unmistakable. Like a truth catching up to a moment that had already passed, Naomi Carter moved with quiet certainty down the center aisle, each step measured, each breath steady. The faint rustle of fabric and paper the only sound that followed her as the courtroom gradually fell into silence. The clerk's voice echoed from the side, formal and practiced, calling the room to order, but it barely registered against the shift already happening in the air, because eyes were no longer focused on schedules or documents. They were fixed on her, on the woman who had entered without hesitation and now approached the bench, with the kind of calm that did not ask for permission. At the front row, Richard Whitmore leaned slightly forward, his earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of uncertainty that he could not quite hide, his gaze narrowing as recognition struggled to form. Emily sat beside him, her posture still composed, but her fingers tightening subtly around her handbag. The memory of the garage not yet fully connected to the reality unfolding in front of her. Naomi reached the steps leading up to the bench, and paused only for a fraction of a second, long enough for the room to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Then she ascended, each step quiet but decisive, the elevated position placing her above the rows of seated figures, above the murmurs that had now completely faded into silence. She set her files down with precise care, aligning them on the polished surface as though everything had always been exactly where it belonged. The clerk glanced toward her, waiting, the room waiting. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to recede. Naomi took her seat, the chair settling beneath her with a soft sound that carried further than it should have, and in that moment the truth locked into place. Richard's expression shifted first, the color draining just enough to reveal the realization beneath, his eyes widening slightly as the connection finally became undeniable. The woman from the garage, the one he had dismissed without a second thought, was now seated above him, not as a passerby, not as someone to be overlooked, but as the authority in the room. Emily's breath caught almost imperceptibly, her gaze lifting, then freezing as she recognized the same calm eyes now, looking out over the courtroom with quiet command. The contrast was immediate and absolute, the echo of their earlier words hanging in the silence between them. Naomi did not react to their recognition, did not acknowledge it. Her focus remained forward, steady, professional, as though the past hour had been nothing more than a passing moment without consequence. She reached for the gavel, her fingers resting lightly against the wood before lifting it with controlled precision. The room seemed to hold its breath, every movement amplified by the stillness. And when the gavel came down, it was not loud, not dramatic, but final, the sound cutting cleanly through the air. Court is now in session. Her voice followed, even and composed, carrying across the room without strain, no trace of hesitation, no hint of emotion beyond the clarity of authority. And as the words settled, the balance of power completed its shift, not through force, not through confrontation, but through presence. Alone, leaving those who had once looked past her now sitting beneath her judgment, unable to look away, unable to return to the certainty they had carried just minutes before the echo of the gavel settled into the room like a line drawn in stone. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, the silence carrying a weight that pressed against every seat, every breath. Naomi Carter sat upright, her posture effortless but precise, hands resting lightly on the bench as her eyes moved across the courtroom with calm intention, not searching, not reacting, simply observing. The clerk began reading the case title, the formal language flowing into the space, steady and procedural, but beneath it something else lingered, something unspoken. In the front row, Richard Whitmore shifted in his seat, the subtle confidence he had worn earlier now fractured, his jaw tightening as he tried to reconcile the image in front of him with the one he had already decided on in the garage. His fingers tapped once against his knee before stopping abruptly, as if even that small motion felt too loud in the presence of the moment. Beside him, Emily Whitmore sat straighter than before, her shoulders drawn back, her expression carefully composed but no longer effortless. Her eyes lifted again toward the bench, then quickly lowered, unable to hold the gaze for long. Naomi reached for the top file, opening it with a measured motion, the sound of paper sliding against wood crisp in the quiet. She read silently for a brief second, absorbing the details, grounding herself fully in the task before her. When she spoke again, her voice carried the same clarity as before, steady, controlled. Without hesitation, she addressed the attorneys first, her tone professional, precise, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. There was no trace of the earlier encounter, no shift in her demeanor that suggested anything personal had occurred. The courtroom responded accordingly. Lawyers stood, adjusted their jackets, began presenting their positions, voices respectful, measured, careful not to overstep. The rhythm of the proceedings built slowly, structured and deliberate, yet beneath it all the tension remained, a quiet current running through the room. Richard's gaze lifted again despite himself, drawn back toward the bench, toward the woman he had dismissed without a second glance, now elevated beyond reach, beyond assumption. His expression tightened further as realization deepened, not just of who she was, but of what that meant for him in this room. Emily clasped her hands together, fingers interlaced, her knuckles faintly pale, her earlier certainty replaced by something far less stable. Naomi continued without interruption, turning a page, asking a question, listening to the response with full attention, her presence anchoring the room, every movement controlled, every pause intentional. There was no need for raised voices or sharp gestures. Authority settled naturally around her, built not from volume, but from consistency, from the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they stood. The overhead lights cast a soft, even glow across the bench, reflecting faintly off the polished wood, highlighting the stillness in her posture, the steadiness in her hands. As the arguments continued, the initial shock in the room began to shift into something else, something deeper, a recognition that went beyond surprise. It was understanding, slow but undeniable, that the roles they had assumed earlier no longer existed here, that the space itself had rewritten them without a single word spoken about it. Naomi closed the file momentarily, her gaze lifting once more across the courtroom, and for the briefest second it passed over Richard and Emily, not lingering, not accusing, simply acknowledging their presence as part of the room, no more, no less. And in that passing glance, the contrast became complete, not because she had changed, but because they finally saw her clearly, and the weight of that realization settled heavier than anything that had been said before. The rhythm of the courtroom settled into something steady, almost predictable, But beneath it the tension had not disappeared. It had only changed shape. Naomi Carter listened as the attorney at the podium continued, his voice careful, each word chosen with precision, aware now of every glance from the bench, aware of the weight behind each response. Naomi did not interrupt. She let the silence between his sentences stretch just enough to make him reconsider his phrasing, just enough to remind him that every detail mattered. Her pen moved once across the margin of the file. A small note, deliberate, controlled, then still again. Across the room, Richard Whitmore shifted in his seat, the subtle movement drawing a quiet glance from Emily, his confidence now replaced with something far less stable. He leaned slightly toward his attorney, whispering under his breath, but the words felt smaller here, less certain. The man at the podium hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, as if even he could feel the shift in energy. Emily kept her gaze forward, but her composure was no longer effortless. Her shoulders held tension, her hands still clasped together tightly. Naomi turned a page, the sound crisp, grounding. She lifted her eyes again, not sharply, not accusingly, just enough to refocus the room. "Counsel, clarify your last point," she said, her tone even, not raised, not harsh. But it carried authority that did not require force. The attorney straightened immediately, adjusting his stance, repeating his argument with greater care. Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, but her attention absolute. Every word measured against the facts in front of her, every pause noted, every inconsistency quietly observed. The courtroom followed her lead, the earlier murmurs gone, replaced by a focused stillness, the kind that only comes when people realize they are being truly seen. Richard's gaze lifted again despite himself, drawn back to the bench, to the calm figure above him. His jaw tightening slightly as the realization settled deeper, not just who she was, but how thoroughly he had misjudged her. Emily exhaled slowly, almost silently, her eyes lowering for a brief moment before returning forward, unable to fully escape the awareness pressing in on her. Naomi closed the file gently, her fingers resting on its edge as she considered the arguments presented. The pause that followed was longer this time, intentional, allowing the room to sit in its own anticipation. Then she spoke again, her voice steady. "The court will take a brief recess." The words landed softly but carried finality. Chairs shifted slightly, the tension releasing just enough to allow movement again, but not enough to restore comfort. Naomi stood, gathering her files with the same precise care, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. She stepped away from the bench without looking back, the door behind her closing with a quiet, decisive click, and as the room began to breathe again, Richard leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on the empty bench, the silence she left behind heavier than any words she had spoken. Emily remained still, her gaze forward, but her thoughts no longer steady, because the moment in the garage had not disappeared. It had followed them here, reshaped, amplified, and now it sat between them and the truth. They could no longer ignore. The hallway outside the courtroom felt quieter than before, not empty, but softened, like the building itself had taken a breath. Naomi Carter moved down the corridor with the same steady pace, the sound of her heels measured against the polished floor, each step deliberate, her hand resting lightly against the stack of files she carried, the edges aligned perfectly, nothing out of place. The overhead lights cast a warm glow across the wood panels, reflecting faintly in the glass doors she passed. But her focus remained inward, not on the movement around her, not on the whispers that trailed just behind her presence, but on the stillness she maintained within. She entered a smaller chamber adjoining the courtroom, the door closing quietly behind her, muting the distant shuffle of voices and shifting chairs. Inside, the air was cooler, still, a space meant for pause rather than performance. Naomi set the files down on the desk, her fingers lingering for a moment on the top page before releasing. She exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from control, allowing the silence to settle fully around her, the faint tick of a wall clock marking time in steady intervals. She moved toward the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The city beyond just beginning to stretch into late morning, cars moving in quiet lines, people crossing streets unaware of the small courtroom above them where lives and decisions intersected. Naomi rested her hands lightly on the edge of the sill, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged. The events from earlier did not replay in her mind as anger or frustration. They appeared instead as something distant, something already understood: the voices, the dismissal, the assumptions. None of it new, none of it unexpected. She had learned long ago that silence could carry more strength than reaction, that dignity did not need to announce itself to be felt. Behind her, a soft knock came at the door, controlled, respectful. Naomi turned slightly. "Come in," she said, her voice calm. The clerk stepped inside, holding a folder, their expression composed but with a trace of something unspoken. "Everything is ready for when you return," they said, placing the folder carefully on the desk. Naomi nodded once in acknowledgement. "Thank you," she replied, her tone even. The clerk hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if considering whether to say more, then simply inclined their head and stepped back out, the door closing again with a soft click. Naomi returned her gaze briefly to the window, then back to the desk. She picked up the new folder, opening it with the same measured precision, scanning the contents quickly, her mind already shifting back into focus. The recess was not an escape. It was a transition, a moment to realign before stepping back into the space where every word would matter. She closed the folder and gathered the files together once more, aligning them in her hands, her movements smooth, unhurried. As she walked back toward the door, the faint echo of voices growing clearer as she approached. She paused only for a second with her hand on the handle, not to hesitate, but to center, to step forward exactly as she intended. Then she opened the door and moved back into the corridor, the rhythm of her steps unchanged, the calm around her intact. While inside the courtroom, the weight of her absence still lingered, waiting to shift again. The moment she returned, the courtroom doors opened again with a soft, controlled motion, and the subtle shift in the room was immediate. Conversations cut short, chairs stilled, and every eye turned forward as Naomi Carter stepped back inside, her presence restoring order without a word. She moved with the same measured pace, files held neatly in her hands, her expression composed, untouched by the pause that had just passed, as if the room had been waiting not just for the session to resume, but for her to return and define it again. She approached the bench, ascending with quiet certainty, the soft echo of each step settling into the silence. And when she sat, the room followed, attorneys straightening, observers leaning forward slightly, attention tightening like a held breath. Naomi placed the files before her, aligning them with precise care, then lifted her gaze, not scanning, not searching, simply present, fully, completely. "Court is back in session," she said, her voice calm, even, yet it carried across the room with unmistakable authority. The proceedings resumed, but something had changed. The earlier tension had deepened into awareness, the kind that could not be undone. Naomi opened the next file, her fingers moving steadily, her focus absolute. She listened as the attorney continued, his tone now more careful, each word weighed, each statement refined under the quiet pressure of her attention. Naomi did not rush him, did not interrupt unnecessarily. She allowed the space for clarity to reveal itself. Then she asked a question, simple, direct, but precise enough to shift the direction of the argument entirely. The attorney paused, recalibrated, responded with more caution. The room followed the exchange closely, every movement, every pause carrying weight. In the front row, Richard Whitmore sat rigid, his earlier composure now replaced by something far more fragile, his gaze fixed on the bench, not in defiance, but in realization. The moment in the garage now fully aligned with the present, the dismissal, the assumptions, the certainty he had carried, all of it now reframed under the reality before him. Emily sat beside him, her posture still controlled, but the confidence she once wore had softened into something quieter. Her eyes no longer avoided the bench, but they did not hold steady either, shifting slightly as if searching for something that no longer existed. Naomi turned another page, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. She was not reacting to them, not acknowledging what had happened, because for her the moment had already passed. It held no power here, not in this space, not in this role. What mattered now was the case, the facts, the responsibility she carried. and she carried it without hesitation, without distraction. As the arguments continued, the shift in the room became undeniable. It was no longer about who held power through status or assumption. It was about who held it through clarity, through integrity, through the quiet strength of knowing exactly who they were. Naomi closed the file briefly, her gaze lifting across the room once more, and for a brief second it rested in the direction of the front row, not lingering, not confronting, simply acknowledging their presence as part of the proceeding, nothing more, nothing less. And in that moment the realization settled completely for Richard and Emily, not as a shock anymore, but as a truth they could not step away from. The roles they had assigned were gone, replaced by something far more real. And as Naomi spoke again, her voice steady, guiding the next phase of the case, the courtroom moved with her, aligned with her rhythm, leaving behind the version of events that had existed just an hour before, replaced now by something quieter, stronger, and impossible to ignore. The final argument settled into the room like a closing note, the attorney's voice fading as he stepped back from the podium, the faint shuffle of papers the only sound that followed. Naomi Carter remained still for a moment, her eyes resting on the file before her, absorbing the last details with quiet precision. The courtroom held its breath again, not out of tension alone, but out of anticipation, the kind that builds when every word has already been weighed and only the outcome remains. Naomi turned a single page, the motion slow, deliberate, then closed the file completely, her hands resting on top of it as she lifted her gaze. The silence deepened, spreading across the room, settling into every corner, every seat. Richard Whitmore sat unmoving now, his earlier restlessness gone, replaced by a stillness that came not from comfort but from understanding. His eyes fixed forward, no longer searching for control, only waiting. Emily sat beside him, her posture straight but softened, her hands no longer tightly clasped but resting quietly in her lap, her gaze steady now, not avoiding, not deflecting, simply present. In the moment she could not change, Naomi looked across the courtroom once more, not lingering on any one person, but acknowledging the space as a whole. Then she spoke, her voice calm, clear, carrying the weight of finality without force. She outlined the court's findings with precision, each point delivered without hesitation, without excess, the language measured, grounded in fact, leaving no room for confusion or interpretation beyond what was necessary. As she spoke, the earlier imbalance dissolved completely, replaced by something firmer, something rooted in clarity rather than assumption. Richard's shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance, the certainty he once carried, replaced by a quiet recognition of the moment's truth. Emily exhaled slowly, her gaze remaining forward, absorbing each word as it landed, not as an attack, but as a consequence of something larger than either of them. Naomi continued, her tone unchanged, steady from beginning to end. When she finished, the room remained silent for a fraction longer, as if adjusting to the absence of her voice. Then she reached for the gavel once more, her hand steady, her movement controlled. The sound that followed was clean and final, marking the end of the session without drama, without emphasis, just completion. "This court is adjourned," she said, the words settling into the room with quiet authority. Chairs shifted, papers gathered, the structured order of the courtroom beginning to loosen as people prepared to leave. But the atmosphere did not return to what it had been before. Something had shifted too deeply for that. Naomi gathered her files, aligning them once more with careful precision, her expression unchanged. She stood, stepping down from the bench with the same calm presence she had carried throughout, not looking toward the front row, not seeking acknowledgement, because none was needed. As she moved toward the exit, the space seemed to part naturally, people stepping aside without being asked, her path clear, defined not by command but by respect. Behind her, Richard remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following the empty space she had left, the weight of the morning settling fully into place. Emily rose slowly, her movements quieter now, more deliberate, and though neither of them spoke, the silence between them carried a recognition that did not need words, the kind that stays long after the moment has passed. As Naomi reached the door and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of it closing behind her was soft, almost unnoticeable, yet it marked the end of something far larger than a single case, leaving behind a room that would not forget what it had just witnessed. The hallway outside the courtroom carried a different kind of silence now, not empty, but settled, like something had been placed back into its proper order. Naomi Carter walked forward with the same steady rhythm, her steps quiet against the polished floor, the files held neatly in her hands, aligned, controlled, nothing out of place. The overhead lights reflected softly along the walls, casting a calm, even glow that followed her as she moved. People passed by in both directions, some speaking in low voices, others glancing briefly before continuing on, but no one interrupted her path. No one questioned her presence. She reached the end of the corridor, where the windows stretched from floor to ceiling, sunlight filtering in, warming the space with a gentle brightness. Naomi slowed slightly, not stopping, just allowing the light to touch her face for a brief moment before continuing, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed. Behind her, far down the hallway, the courtroom doors opened again, the faint sound carrying just enough to signal movement. Richard Whitmore stepped out first, his pace slower than before, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty. His gaze lowered for a moment before lifting again, searching, not for confrontation, but for something he could not fully define. Emily followed beside him, her steps quieter, her earlier sharpness softened into something more reflective. They did not speak at first, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with the weight of what had just unfolded. Richard glanced down the corridor and saw her, not far ahead, walking with the same calm presence that had defined the entire morning. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took a step forward. "Judge Carter," he called out, his voice controlled, but carrying a trace of something unfamiliar. Naomi paused, not abruptly, just enough to acknowledge the sound. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his from across the distance, steady, neutral, not inviting, not rejecting, simply present. Richard closed the gap slowly, each step measured, as if aware that whatever he said next would not change what had already been established. Emily remained just behind him, her posture reserved, her expression quiet. When he reached a respectful distance, he stopped, the air between them still. "About earlier," he began, the words slower than usual, chosen carefully. "I misjudged the situation." He did not elaborate, did not excuse. The sentence simple, direct. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, her expression unchanged, the silence stretching just enough to allow the weight of his words to settle. Then she spoke, her voice calm, even. "What matters is how people choose to see others when it counts." There was no edge in her tone, no accusation, just clarity. Richard nodded once, the movement, small but genuine. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, then looked back up, her eyes steadier now, not searching for approval, but acknowledging something she had not before. Naomi did not wait for more. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of closure rather than continuation, then turned and resumed walking, her steps returning to their steady rhythm, the conversation complete without needing anything further. Behind her, Richard and Emily remained where they stood for a moment longer, neither speaking, both aware that the exchange had not been about forgiveness or consequence, but about recognition, the kind that does not fade once it has been seen clearly. The hallway returned to its quiet flow as Naomi continued forward, the light ahead bright, steady, unchanged, and as she walked into it, her figure remained composed, grounded, carrying with her the same quiet strength that had never needed to be proven, only revealed, leaving behind a space that felt just a little different than before, as if something unseen had finally been understood.